that point really around um, low risk, and I think Alison mentioned this as well, low risk exemptions, proportionality. We've seen a lot around we've talked a lot, everybody has today really around the legislation, how it's kind of focused on protection rather than recovery. So I guess my question really, and I think it's probably a question certainly for Eve, Audrey, and for Alison, but I'd really like to get your view, Jen, as well, from an industry scale point of view, is how could that perhaps proportionality, the exemptions, another two different things, but proportionality around it work in practice? Because everybody seems to say, how can we compare a small restoration project compared to a large industry project? And yet the legislation doesn't have any flexibility. So I guess my question is really how could that work in practice?
I can have a go at answering that. So, yeah, I mean, that's the problem at the moment, is that it's the same rule for all projects, and particularly through sort of environmental permitting or licensing. I think the exemption side can be a bit tricky because it has to fall into that really low risk category. And I think there are opportunities, as I've said, through looking at sort of self-service, but exemptions, I think, will be difficult. I think we need to certainly look into whether or not there could be a different process or determination process altogether for restoration activities if we are to better support them. That is something that we've been thinking about as well, but I think that's going to take quite a large change. I'm not quite sure we have the supportive policy for that yet, but it's something that we are working on, and we certainly know would be good.
Thanks, Eve. Jen.
Thank you. So perhaps this isn't the popular view. I think perhaps it contrasts with what some of my fellow panelists might, how they might see this issue. But I just can't help but go back to, why do we have our existing rules in place as they are? They're there to protect the environment. And so I don't think I would, I don't think it's necessarily been, tabled with industry members, but I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that if we had a separate licensing process for one type of project just because the intention was, restoration, as opposed to a project where the intention is development of some kind, it doesn't quite make sense to me, because the point of going through the consenting process is to ensure that we're not having a negative impact on the environment. So I think actually the thing that I would agree with what others have said is that the consenting process is really frustrating and it takes a long time. And there are lots of improvements that we should be able to make the consenting process for all of the types of projects that are going through it. I don't think the answer is create a separate track just for those projects that are delivering some sort of nature restoration or recovery. And at the end of the day, if you think, if you come back as well, if you think about the types of interventions that are happening at the moment, often they're coming as a result of requirements to deliver compensation under the habitats regulations. Or if we're talking about future projects that will be marine net gain projects, they'll be part of the consenting process for developers. So I think we can't necessarily decouple the two, but I think that we can channel this need for improvement into the existing consenting process. It shouldn't take so long. It shouldn't be as complex or as bureaucratic as it currently is for anyone.
Thanks, Jen. So I suppose really, I mean, I'm just going to come back to you on this really. So I think you finished there saying, the process shouldn't be as long, shouldn't be as complex for anybody, whatever they're doing in the marine environment. I think that's almost a given. Everybody wants that. So I guess I just want to probe a little bit deeper in. You started off very clearly saying this may not be everyone's in agreement about not having this kind of two-track or two different processes. I suppose really the question that the delegate the viewers might want to hear is why not? What are you concerned about, I suppose, by having two processes, or what would be the consequence of that, I guess, or the potential consequence of that?
I think it's more from a kind of I wasn't really expecting to go down this line. I don't know why I get, but I think it's more from a kind of a principled perspective. So lots of the things that we've heard said about risk aversion with decision making, this applies to the consenting process as a whole. And so to dilute the resource that's already there, to create more complexity by having multiple tracks, I think would make the situation worse rather than better.
Okay.
I'm open to being persuaded, open to be persuaded otherwise, but I think I think that there are improvements that we need to make to our consenting process. Full stop.
Yeah. Right. Yes, it's really interesting. It's because it doesn't exist now. It's a really interesting debate, really, a discussion about what would unintended consequences, I guess, as well. Audrey, I'll bring you in on this one.
I think building on what both Eve and Jen said there, through our sort of ongoing work on this MNG sort of pilot development project, which is looking at the sort of unknowns and knowns about the existing legislation and how you might be able to use that to deliver MNG. It's sort of become apparent how you sort of assess marine licenses is very much about looking at the impact. So it's very much about ensuring you're protecting. So you don't necessarily need another twin track approach, but maybe we need sort of guidance that enables the ability to assess the benefits as well as the impacts, and therefore you can sort of bring it in. So I think, just thinking about it in my head, so example of compensation, big kitty-weight tower, would that fit into positive nature restoration thing, but actually you're sort of installing something quite physical in the environment? So would that then fit down the sort of marine license thing? I think you could then have that awkwardness of which pot does it fit in, whereas if you could have it in the same track, but the ability to actually say this is actually beneficial and we need to assess it through this process, rather than we've got to look at the impacts of this and what are they, sort of thing. I think that would maybe enable that to happen, and faster perhaps.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess there's process and there's kind of outcome, isn't there? Really, we're talking about process here, but everyone's talking about the positive, good outcome. Really, I'll come back to you even 1 second if you don't mind, but I just want to get Alison's view very quickly on because you said about in your brief introduction, didn't you, around I guess proportionality around it and this issue.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Audrey was just saying there. No, I don't think anyone's asking for a two-tier system. I think it is looking at moving away, trying to, I guess, look at that benefits. Again, if we're looking at long-term, what's going to be a resilient coastal habitat into the future, we can't always be looking at the detrimental impacts on conservation and features, I think. But absolutely, we've asked for a long time to have a comprehensive system that protected our natural environment, our marine environment, and having that protection is absolutely essential. And I don't think anyone's asking for that to shift. I guess where perhaps we'd like to see a two-tier system is on the charging and the prices of it, because as a nature NGO, that we have very limited resources behind it. So perhaps where it comes in to looking at achieving national targets for nature restoration and strategy, and lots of tools perhaps coming through with the compensation recovery fund and different things, is how can we channel that funding into support and process licensing, making that accessible, I guess, to achieve our national targets. But yeah, I can imagine that having two-tier systems would add extra complexity and lots of legal wormholes and all sorts of nightmares.
Yeah, it would. Eve, do you want to come back in? And I want to actually come back in a second once you responded to this point around cost, really. Eve.
Yeah, it was just and Alison's kind of explained it really how I was going to put it. It might not necessarily be a completely different system. It's more how could you better support those types of applications through that determination process. And it could be down to cost. It's certainly something we would like to look into, but also we know that if we can make improvements and help people get their applications up to scratch, all that sort of stuff will save cost. It's about getting it right on the onset. It's about helping people to really prepare for their applications, helping people perhaps with that habitats regulations assessment, getting Natural England on board from the onset so they know where these activities are actually going to happen. We've also got some really great tools coming out of our memory, such as Restoration Project Platform. And this is going to start to give people an idea about where all these restoration projects are actually happening at the moment. and that's going to help sort of get people, more visibility of where these activities are happening, and that could all help as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what Eve was saying there, and I thought it was really interesting some of the things you mentioned, Eve, in your slides as well, about taking that more strategic approach, whether you're applying it at a marine plan level, but if you've got that pooling of resources and, a shared objective of what you're trying to achieve for that, local ecosystem in that marine plan area, then that's going to have its benefits. I think there's definitely interesting things to explore there, and definitely be thinking about that when we're doing this third project on strategic marine net gain, because we've drawn the boundary, in line with the East Marine Plan area, and we'll be looking across the piece at what restoration opportunities there are there. So if there was then a collective moving forward through I don't know exactly how it would work, but definitely really interested in those ideas.
Thanks, Jen. I just want to come back to the cost element. Obviously, Alison mentioned it in particular. You mentioned earlier, Eve, about looking into, I think you said, subsidies for licensing. I don't know if you've got any more you can say about, perhaps not when, but what that could look like, or what that could be, or what the sort of things you've been investigating.
Yeah, so interestingly, we actually have under our flood risk assessment permits already under the EA, we have a separate category which, as long as people can prove it's for environmental good, where they can prove that it's not for commercial gain and it's not for profit, then they can get a subsidy on their flood risk assessment permit. So we probably use a similar category sort of styling, where we'd say, if we can prove that it's a restoration project, it's for environmental good, it's not for profit, not for commercial gain, then we could provide a subsidy. But the key is where does that funding come from to provide that subsidy? Now, there could be opportunities through things such as the government sort of, announcing a restoration fund. Could it come from there, perhaps? Could it come from other funding pots? We don't know yet, and we have been looking into it, and it's still sort of on the cards, I like to think. And that could cover the cost of, the whole marine license application.
Right, thank you. Alison.
Could I just, where does it come from for the rivers? I know, because this is something we talked about over the years, and so there must be for the flood risk.
Yeah, so currently I think it comes from our grant and aid pot, which isn't ideal considering that's running dry at the moment. So yeah, it's I don't know how sustainable that is, and I suspect that they would have to start looking for alternative funding pots as well. But it just goes to show that it can happen. And actually, I'd like to see it happen through other areas of our permitting as well. But flood risk was one of the sort of major ones where we have a lot of work through on restoration. So yeah.
Thanks. And just say in the chat on this topic, we've been talking about proportionality or exemption. In the chat, there's a little discussion around the Welsh Government have recently consulted on exempting seagrass restoration from requiring a marine licence, and people asking really if that perhaps they could look at that in Scotland and UK as well. I want to come on to there's lots of questions in the Q&A around marine net gain. Now, a number of people have spoken about it on this webinar this afternoon already. So I just want to come to you really just to get your view on its developing process. And I think, Jen, right at the very top, you talked about how the metrics and how the intertidal area is perhaps not ideal. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what SUDG, what industry believes, or what they want really from marine net gain at the moment.
So I think I touched on a few of the things that we've concluded as a group, and again we've talked over this a lot in the task and finish group. So this is a shared position with some of the ENGOs, and we've had kind of good feedback with the SNCB. So it's a kind of collective thinking on what marine net gain should be. And the kind of the ultimate conclusion was that for us to see real benefits in the marine environment, we need to take strategic action. We can't just have net gain being coupled onto every small development, and then there being a lot of effort and cost associated with delivering something essentially to tick a box. If we can pull those resources, if we can look more holistically about what's needed, and then take action that addresses those areas of need, then we're going to be more effective. In terms of the practicalities about how, I think that's still very much up in the air. I know that DEFRA have run their consultation on principles for marine net gain, and I think as industry we were largely supportive of what they put forward in that consultation, but I don't think there's been any more official communication on marine net gain from DEFRA, and I wouldn't like to try and speak on behalf of them, but I know that from an industry perspective, as long as we have an approach which is proportionate and pragmatic, and we are not adding another layer of complexity which will result in additional time for a consenting process, as long as we're avoiding that, then you have quite broad support for the concept from marine industries. In terms of the kind of the nuance there, I think is you talked about the metric in the intertidal zone, and Audrey quite rightly used the definition from DEFRA about what marine net gain would be, which is leaving something in a measurably better state. And I think that's where the challenge comes on net gain, because as soon as you start trying to measure, then you get very complicated very quickly, trying to do the accounting of, how much is this fish worth on our spreadsheet and how many fish can we deliver as a result. And, I'm not an ecologist or a biologist or any of the ologists. But so it gets very complicated very quickly. And I think that there's still lots of conversations to be had about what the alternative is. But from my perspective, I think there has to be a simpler way that we avoid tying ourselves up in knots, and we actually get from the point of A to B much faster, or A to C, I don't know where we're going. But so we're taking the contributions from industry and actually turning that into restoration and marine recovery, without, spending lots of money on paper and complex processes in between. Do you want me to keep talking about the intertidal metric? And I did see a question about the overlap.
Yeah, I was actually going to come to that. Yeah, it's a good segue, really. That point around how might they interact, the terrestrial and the marine. And I'll come to Audrey on that as well after you, Jen.
Well, maybe Audrey's better placed to answer than me, because I think it's a big question mark, and it's a really important question mark that needs to be answered. And I think even now, so biodiversity net gain under the terrestrial system applies to mean low water, but obviously if you do some activity in the intertidal zone, you need a marine license. Yet I'm still not clear exactly how the MMO would deal with the requirement to apply biodiversity net gain to a project. So I think there's a lot of complexity that's just come in from the biodiversity net gain requirements, and we're only just starting to see some examples coming out now where it's causing real problems for people that operate at that interface, at that land sea interface. So I don't have the answer, but I can tell you it's definitely a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Audrey, do you have can you shine any light on this?
I don't have an answer either. No, I think it's definitely it's a key part of the consideration under the MNG pilots project, and it's also something that we had at the back of our mind through the marine net gain assessment framework. DEFRA rightly is trying to separate them so you don't have overlapping systems. So BNG intertidal metric definitely stops at low water mark, and marine net gain will go from low water mark outwards. I think how that operates in practice is still very much something that's in thinking. I think we're sort of looking at suggesting you look at the coastal concordat as a way to kind of help sort of bridge that gap between sort of local authorities and sort of MMO and sort of marine thinking. I think estuaries is definitely a key area. As I sort of touched on my presentation, we have recommended that marine net gain sort of points towards good environmental status as its North Star that everything's trying to deliver to, but actually estuaries is a bit of a gap. because actually that's under the Water Framework Directive. So how do you sort of factor that into consideration? So I think that's something that needs to be very much tested, and we definitely don't have answers to it at the moment, but it's definitely not something that's been brushed under the carpet. It's sort of left, right and centre, I think, in people's thinking, because you are going to have projects, and say a cable project coming ashore where they're actually predominantly doing MNG and then suddenly have to do a small bit of BNG. How does that work in practice to make sure you're not tying themselves in knots and making it very complicated? So yeah, I don't have an answer. I don't think there is an answer yet, but I think it's definitely in forefront of people's minds.
Can I jump back in, David? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
sure.
So I think like I said, it's a problem. I think we're seeing examples now where, because of the rigidity of the metric, there's a couple of estuarine examples that I've heard of that I can't give the specifics of, but they're looking at conversations they're having with local knowledgeable statutory nature conservation advisors, where what's being said by the people in the know is not matching up with what the spreadsheet tells you must do to answer the requirement. And that is something that I think we all want to avoid at all costs, because it then just becomes a paper shifting process. And so I think it's really frustrating at the moment for people operating in that space. We've had it for just over a year now. And from the SUDG, our ask is that once we have a good proportionate approach in the marine, it would be applied up to mean high water, because we think the intertidal is more, or a marine approach would be more relevant to the intertidal than the approach that's been designed for terrestrial being applied in the intertidal.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Eve, do you want to come in on this point?
Oh, I was just going to say, and somebody's put it in the chat, that the biodiversity net gain comes under the Town and Country Planning Act. So the Marine Management Organisation don't do biodiversity net gain as it stands at the moment, because they follow the Marine and Coastal Access Act. So ideally, if we're looking at marine net gain, then we'd almost want that area of overlap, or we need it captured somehow through the Marine and Coastal Access Act. So that's biodiversity net gain needs to be under the Marine and Coastal Access Act, ideally as well, to low water, or like I said, or there'll be that area of overlap so that we can kind of capture it under marine net gain as well.
Thank you. I just got a quick question for you, Audrey, here. Then I want to move on to talk about communities and local recovery plans. There's just a quick question in the Q&A saying, is there a connection between MNG and the delivery opportunities from offshore development compensation? So I guess the question is really around compensation and marine net gain, and are they linked, and could they be linked, or are they not linked?
I think, again, as MNG is such a policy in development, there's no definitive answer to that, and that's definitely a decision for DEFRA, so I would definitely want to put words in their mouth. But I think ultimately, yes, I don't think you can completely uncouple them. I think there's obviously concerns around the challenge to actually find compensation in the marine environment, and if you then allow some of those measures to be used for marine net gain, are you sort of inadvertently making it even harder down the line to deliver compensation? So I think from a very practical perspective, that needs to be considered. But from sort of talking to external stakeholders and what it means, they just see it as more management in the marine environment to deliver nature restoration. So I think from that perspective, it needs to be coupled up and joined. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to explain to a fisherman, that they don't really mind which policy levers sort of pulling. It's delivering something on the ground which potentially restricts what they're doing. So I think I haven't got a definite answer to that, but I think from when you're at that outward community bit, segueing into your next thing, I think we need to be careful and joined up about how we're pitching it and what we're saying.
And can I jump in from an industry perspective? So if you are, if we're at a point in the future where marine net gain is a requirement of the consenting process, if you're already doing something to deliver compensation, it would be so much more straightforward to just do a little bit more that could be your net gain. And it comes back to all of the difficulties we have about how you calculate things and how you apportion, oh yes, this is my compensation, but that's my net gain. And that's, on paper, that's really difficult to meet our requirements. That's difficult. But in a practical sense of delivering a project, if you're delivering an active intervention somewhere, it makes so much more sense that you just pull those resources, you pull those two different requirements, and you deliver it all at one time.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I'm going to move on slightly from M&G for a minute and come to this community point. And I'm going to come to you, Alison, having worked with a lot of communities around the delivery of lots of your projects. There's one point in the Q&A mentioning around can decisions be made more locally? But another point that's been raised really is how to develop equitable consenting and licensing application processes that enable bottom-up community restoration efforts. So I guess the question in summary is, how can local communities be involved in the process of decision making, but also involved in the actual restoration process themselves, rather than government or rather than NGOs? How in your experience can that or does that happen?
I think that, there's a few questions in there. Just thinking about the licensing process for a start. I saw our poor MMO colleagues up in the northeast being called faceless in the chat, but I don't think it's that. I think ultimately it comes back down to it's a central point for administrative point, but actually what are the decisions being made by and advice given by local for example, Natural England officers or people with the experts with local knowledge. So I think that's feeding in. So it's just a sort of administrative centre more than not using local knowledge in that. But to reflect on, the role of a community or an NGO who want to deliver it, it is that absolute sort of forward planning, strategic thinking, partnership working. I've heard it called recently the quadruple helix of sitting around the table. So basically having government, having industry, having community society, having academia or the NGOs around the table together to co-create, to develop those strategic plans and do it in advance of looking at what licensing and permits that you need. So if you're creating a multi-habitat seascape plan, whatever scale it is, or seascape is a bigger scale, but in a region, co-create that together, sit down at the table and co-create, and then you've got invested from everyone at the outset. So whether it be you're getting your statutory nature conservation advice, but you're getting it informal around the table. So when you're preparing your restoration plans, that's what's submitted. And a lot of the discussions and a lot of the fears and a lot of the risks, potential risk, can be ironed out at that early stage. And so this is why I really like the idea of these strategic seascape plans. Jen, if you want to do one on the southeast, we've just written a Greater Thames Estuary seascape plan or in process. So that's ready on the shelf, ready to go if you want to test it with be it strategic marine net gain or whatever. But I think it is that investing at the outset of having everyone at the table to create that shared vision and get the pinch points ironed out at the outset, whether it's a aquaculture facility, kelp farm, whether it's a port coming in, where are those pinch points, and then collectively can work together. And I think anyone can do it if you're getting that strategic vision and the strategic plans and the areas. Genuinely, I mean, it doesn't really, all of us can do it, whether all of us can do it. We can do it if we're an offshore wind company, or we can do it if we're local neighborhoods. It's having that collective vision and that fitting into national ambitions. I think it's exciting.
Yeah, cheers. Eve, do you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. So we've had some really good experience through the Championing Coastal Coordination, or the 3Cs, which was basically some government funding that was handed out through expressions of interest to various coastal groups around the country, and funding where they could champion that coastal approach, and it encouraged things such as restoration and working together with local groups and communities. One really good example was the Living Dart project, where they got funding to investigate kind of community engagement and investigate where restoration could happen. And it got loads of parishes involved and got them, really thinking about restoration activity. And then it put them in a really good position to apply for funding to actually practically restore under the Rememory project pipeline. So a really good outcome there of how that government can provide that platform for others to invest with confidence as well, because they were then receiving, other funds. And another thing is that the Coastal Partnerships Network have been developing a coastal hub, and actually this is through funds, 3Cs funds. And that hub is going to act as a kind of a one-stop shop, I suppose, for all things coastal. And it will link to our Environment Agency and Crown Estate project platform. And we're really hoping that this will really help communities get together. They'll know where restoration activity is going to be happening, hopefully know how and where to get involved, and also potentially linked to funding sources. So really some really positive things on the horizon.
Thanks, Eve. I'm going to stay with you for a second, and I want to really dig into this strategic element. Really, we've talked about a couple of times, but before we do that, just there's a couple of questions here around. I guess somebody saying the passive restoration is important, and if we think about passive in the sense of removing pressures or MPAs, the question really is around how being from the Environment Agency, one of the very few organisations that span that kind of very nearshore area into tidal and up into the uplands and the rivers. How has the work done, or has work been done to link the consenting, the permitting, the policy process going from coastal, marine, and upland?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually something that we're really trying to champion through the Environment Agency, through the large organisation, is that source to sea thinking. So it's about how, all of those inputs into our river systems upstream are really impacting on our estuarine and coastal waters. So there can be definitely challenges around some of our slightly siloed approach. But there is that drive to want to connect up more and how we really improve our water systems. So a lot of we do this through our river basin planning. So that's our biggest kind of driver to really think about that source to sea thinking. And within the river basin plans, which also link to things such as marine plans, we have a number of actually hundreds of programs of measures which are put in place. And this kind of, the plan itself is very complex. There are so many things in it, in our river basin management plans, and it encompasses things such as our plans under working with water companies through the price review or the periodic review, which is where you're looking at water companies and how they're investing in improvements to the water environment. It also brings in some of our flood and coastal risk management, asset management, and all the sort of habitat improvements that we're doing through there as well. So yeah, that I'd say river basin plans is our main route to doing that. And we're really going to work on embedding loads more estuarine and coastal measures into future plans. So the ones that were published in December 22, there was the first time that we had specific estuarine and coastal measures within the plans. They go out to 1 nautical mile, but I think in the past it's been mostly river focused. So we're really getting onto it now and really helping the organisation to think source to sea.
Thanks, Eve. It's great. I just want to move on to this talk about strategic plans, really. And I think if you think back to what you said earlier, Audrey, actually about regional programs and measures, down to the local level. We've talked about, Jen, you talked about working at the marine plan level for the third part of your piece of work. And I think, Eve, you talked about almost predefined areas, really. So I just want to dig into this more strategic element, and Alison's already put her hand up to be the pilot for some of this, is, again, how could this work in practice, and really what is the kind of need and desire for this? There seems to be a real kind of, it's coming through this conversation quite a lot, moving from the individual or the reactive or the small scale, whatever small we define as, into this bigger, more strategic element. And the other thing that's come through really clearly is speed. I think you've all talked about speed and the need for speed in all of this, really. So I guess my question is just to dig a little bit deeper, really, on perhaps what you said, Jen, around the plan level, the marine plan level stuff, and Eve, you talked about the predefined areas, really, and how that might translate into actually doing it on the ground for somebody like Alison. I don't know who would like to start on that, or Jen or Eve. Jen?
I can have a go, but because it's easier to go first, I think. So it's one of the things that we have talked about a little bit under the umbrella of marine net gain, but actually it applies to all efforts. So if we have this, we already have clear ideas about where we're failing, and Audrey's talked about linking to GES, and we already have probably a clear idea about where we're failing. There's also lots of work going on at the moment. So in Wales, I think they're mapping their restoration potential. We've got Natural England's Maripo projects, which have started looking at restoration potential. There's lots of information that exists, but we don't have that clear, agreed direction. And so from in the umbrella of marine net gain, we're saying we need these clear, higher level strategic targets. And maybe targets is the wrong word, but we need these clear objectives that we're trying to achieve. And then you break it down into, and what does that look like in this local level? And then that's not to say that there's going to be one body that is delivering at the local level. It's a guidebook, isn't it? It's a way of saying this is what's needed. And if you deliver a project that's answering these questions, then you're contributing to that broader objective, which will hopefully help us see bigger improvements. So it's wishy-washy, but it's about taking those higher level things that we all recognise we need to achieve, and then making it publicly available. And then when Alison comes along with the project that she's defined, she knows that she's contributing to this wider connectivity. And the same for a developer who is doing something in addition for their corporate social responsibility. And there are different examples of these different players who are actually doing the delivery, but it's all happening independently and in a disconnected way. So if we had that collective, this is what we're aiming for, and this is what it means locally, and that would have to come from government.
And I think that's really helpful. And I think what that does as well, that concept really is to drive that pace, isn't it? If everybody knows in advance where they're going on some of this stuff. I'll come to you, Alison, yes, and then come to you, Eve. Alison?
Thank you. I think it's just picking up on that very last point that Jennifer made. As a marine biologist, I seem to spend, or our teams and other people who like to think about these sort of things, we're truly trying to drive that ecosystem function, and that really trying to get our marine habitats, our ecosystems to work going into the future, thinking 100 years ahead. So even just forgetting all the paperwork and the policy and the legislation and the licensing, what we were keen to look at is sort of that bigger scale ecosystem functioning. What is the level that it's going to reach the tipping point, the positive tipping point of becoming self-sustaining? And that might be me turning up with my little project with seagrass here, but it might mean WWF or Wildlife Trust or RSPB, National, or Orsted or whoever turning up as well. But if we've got that coherence and we understand where we're going to drive this for this ecosystem function, we can do it over time. It will take us 100 years to, well, hopefully it'll be sooner, but we need to lift our eyes to that much bigger, longer distance. And so that strategic level thinking is really important. But I just want to say, let's look at what a ecologically functioning long-term vision, and do that in light of climate change as well, so that we can look for where we should be moving, where the shifting habitats are, where should we be focusing it, and then overlay the policy and the paperwork on top of that. Right. I probably went a bit passionate about that, but anyway, if you know what I mean.
Good. Passion's good. I'll just come to Eve, then I'll come to you, Audrey.
Yeah, so I was going to say that actually a lot of the work we're doing under our natural capital ecosystem assessment programme has been really great at giving us loads of evidence around the benefits that all these natural ecological systems provide, and it's about how we then share those benefits with the sort of coastal communities, with government, with the wider public, so that people get on board and understand what it is that they need to protect and why they need to protect it, because they'll care about it and they'll understand the benefits. And then I think it's then about going out to those local communities and really sharing that information, which we can do through a number of ways, such as a coastal hub or restoration project platform, and really get people involved. And then at that local level, think about that change that's needed, that where that restoration we need to really focus and how that can happen. I really think that there's a lot more thinking of bringing in communities to the conversation more and more these days. There's that, if there's that want and that care and that love for, making that change, particularly at your local level, then it will really help. And I think having all that evidence on the benefits is really going to help with that as well.
Thanks, Audrey.
No, I totally agree with all of that sort of thing. I think, yes, as Alison talked about, I think the benefit of that strategic approach is that very much that ecosystem functionality. So it's drawing together all those smaller projects to understand how they're delivering benefits collectively. And I guess the things that will come back to around marine net gain, obviously this is wider than just marine net gain nature restoration, is that they're potentially looking at using it for mobile species as well. So therefore you definitely need that much broader ecosystem look to actually understand the benefits, and that's probably across even different marine plan areas depending on how wide ranging those mobile species are. And I think, it's definitely having that framework, isn't it? Because I think one of the things we're struggling with, as Jen alluded to on marine net gain, is this measurability bit. So it's not just going out to do seagrass restoration and then that's what you've done. It's kind of the so what are you trying to measure? What's your direction of travel? So if you can link into that much bigger good environmental status or something else, it helps you sort of contribute towards something rather than just your one standalone project having to demonstrate all its benefits independently. And just picking up a point in the chat there around sort of investments, that's something we've looked at and explored at a very high level in the marine net gain assessment framework, is sort of, is it possible to use a sort of market mechanism to help drive this? And it's very much, if you've got a potential plan, it definitely helps investment, and that investment then can help funding for local projects to actually go and deliver those restoration, recognizing that maybe developers and stuff aren't the experts in this area, so maybe they could pay into a fund which others could then bid into who are experts in that restoration. That's a way to help generate cash, but also mean that you get meaningful restoration from local groups.
Right, thanks, Audrey. And there's something in the chat really, and kind of on some of the points you made around thinking about local nature recovery strategies, the ones that are used on land really, and can they be mirrored for the marine environment? I'm going to sum up in a second, but I just want to give you the chance to have one last word really, and if you could think about what would be the one thing you'd like to see next really. There's a lot of stuff that people want to do around licensing and policy change, and we talked about speed and that kind of thing, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start with one step. So if I could just ask you to think about what is the one thing you'd like to see next in all of this, and keep it brief please because we're running out of time. So I'll come to you, Eve, first and say what's the one thing that you'd like to see next?
These local seascape restoration plans. I think we need them. We need that local engagement. And
Great, thank you. Jen?
I'd like to see DEFRA move forward with the marine net gain policy. I think I think it's an exciting time. There's lots of opportunities, and and industry are supportive of the approach. NGOs are supportive of the approach. So let's get cracking.
Excellent. Alison?
I'd like all my MMO invoices to be counted. No, I'm joking. I'd like to see. I really like the idea of the strategic licensing at that seascape scale and looking at that. Yeah, I think he was talking about local, but yeah, at that coherence side of it, so that we have a clear path over time. That if you're allowed to follow certain rules, and I'm very much here about how restoration can be just as damaging as or can be damaging, but that this licensing would enable it. Strategic licensing could enable it.
Right, thank you, Alison. And Audrey, finally.
I'm going to the opposite end of the spectrum. I'd like to see that sort of strategic nature restoration plan, that overarching framework, sort of kicked off, and just definitely involving everybody that has involvement in marine policy areas, not just sort of DEFRA. It has to be across that area, because then that can provide the framework for all the local stuff that we want to deliver as well.
Right, thank you. Well, thank you all. I'll just summarise now. Really, I think what I've heard today and what we've all heard today really is that kind of need for pace, the need for speed, and not additional burden and additional cost really. And I think that strategic planning has really shone through quite a lot really. And I think process change, even Audrey has spoken about this, potentially around MNG, but also this as we said at the end, of these kind of predefined or strategic areas really, in the work that the SUDG is doing now, really that. And the third phase around the marine plan scale is really good. There's been a lot of talk today. We've concentrated a lot on England. We've touched on Wales a little bit, and we'll be covering other areas of the UK and further afield as well, because I think that's really important for this marine restoration piece. The panel debate will be has been recorded and will be on the OCF website and on the YouTube channel soon. I'd just like to finally thank our amazing panel: Jennifer Godwin, the Seabed User and Developer Group, Audrey Jones from Howell Marine Consulting, Alison Debney from the Zoological Society of London, and Eve Leaguewater from the Environment Agency. And thank all of you for watching here today, and goodbye.